Imagine a man standing at the crossroads of divine revelation and personal ambition, a prophet whose name is both revered and reviled. This is Balaam, a figure shrouded in mystery, whose story is as captivating as it is cautionary. Balaam appears in the Bible as a prophet with extraordinary spiritual insight, yet his legacy is tarnished by greed and moral compromise. Who was he, and why does his tale resonate so deeply with the struggles we face today? Balaam first enters the biblical narrative in the book of Numbers, summoned by Balaak, the king of Moab. Balaak was desperate to halt the advance of the Israelites, a people who had emerged victorious from Egypt and were now encroaching upon his territory. Balaak feared their strength and sought supernatural intervention to defeat them. His plan? Hire Balaam to curse the Israelites. But Balaam was no ordinary prophet. He was a man who claimed to hear directly from God, yet his heart was divided. The Bible tells us that Balaam had a reputation for possessing great spiritual power. People believed that whatever he blessed was blessed, and whatever he cursed was cursed. This reputation made him the perfect candidate for Balaak's scheme. However, Balaam's connection to God came with a significant caveat. He could only speak what God allowed him to say. This sets the stage for a story filled with divine intervention, moral dilemmas, and a stark warning about the consequences of letting greed override obedience. Now, take a moment to reflect. What would you do if faced with a choice between material wealth and unwavering faithfulness to God's will? Balaam's story isn't just about an ancient prophet. It's about the choices we make every day. It challenges us to ask, how often do we let our own desires cloud our judgment? As we delve deeper into Balaam's life, you'll see how this prophet's actions unfold in a series of events that are both extraordinary and deeply human. From his surreal encounter with a talking donkey to his ultimately tragic end, Balaam's story reminds us of the fine line between spiritual gifting and spiritual downfall. So, who was Balaam? He was a man with the ability to hear God's voice, but lacked the integrity to obey it fully. His story is both a marvel and a warning, a tale that challenges us to examine our own hearts and the motives that drive our decisions. And now, with the stage set, let us explore the world into which Balaam was called, a world fraught with political tension, fear, and the clash of divine will against human ambition. To understand Balaam's story, we must first grasp the historical and political landscape of his time. The Israelites, having been delivered from Egypt, were now journeying toward the Promised Land. Their victories over neighboring kingdoms sent waves of fear throughout the region, especially to Moab. This small kingdom, nestled near the Dead Sea, was led by King Balaak, who viewed the Israelites not just as a threat, but as an existential crisis for his people. The book of Numbers, chapters 22 to 24, paints a vivid picture of the tension. The Israelites had camped near the plains of Moab, and their presence loomed large over the terrified Moabites. Balaak, realizing that military might alone wouldn't be enough to defeat this divinely protected people, sought a spiritual weapon, a curse to weaken Israel. Enter Balaam. Balaak believed that if Balaam cursed the Israelites, their divine protection would be stripped away. But why Balaam? It's crucial to note that Balaam's fame as a prophet extended beyond Moab. People across the region revered him as someone who could manipulate spiritual forces, which made him the perfect ally for Balaak's desperate plan. The stakes were incredibly high. Moab feared annihilation, while Israel marched forward under God's promise. This backdrop sets the tension between human schemes and divine sovereignty. Balaak's strategy reveals an important truth. When faced with fear, humans often turn to manipulation and control rather than seeking peace or understanding. How often do we, like Balaak, try to force outcomes instead of trusting in a higher plan? Visually, imagine this scene. A vast encampment of Israelites stretching across the plains, their numbers seemingly endless, while the Moabite king watches from his stronghold, his advisors whispering of impending doom. The tension is palpable, the fear visible in every Moabite's face. But here lies the irony. While Balaak sought to curse Israel, he was unaware that their God was not just powerful, but unyielding in his promises. This tension between human ambition and divine will drive the story forward, setting the stage for Balaam's fateful decisions. Reflect on this for a moment. How do we respond when faced with challenges that seem insurmountable? Do we, like Balaak, seek shortcuts and schemes? Or do we trust that there's a greater plan at work, even when the path seems unclear? Balaam is one of the Bible's most enigmatic characters, a man of undeniable spiritual insight. He stood at the intersection of obedience to God and the allure of earthly wealth and recognition. His story reveals a prophet torn between two masters, God and his own desires. It's this internal struggle that defines Balaam, making him both a cautionary tale and a mirror for our own divided hearts. When Balak's emissaries first approached Balaam, they came bearing gifts. The allure of riches was clear. Balaak wanted Balaam to curse Israel in exchange for substantial rewards. Yet Balaam's initial response was seemingly righteous. He told the messengers, "Spend the night here, and I will bring back the answer the Lord gives me." Numbers 22:8. On the surface, Balaam appeared to prioritize God's will over human demands. But beneath this surface lies a subtle, yet significant flaw. Balaam didn't immediately reject the proposal. Instead, he entertained it, perhaps hoping God would change his mind. That night, God spoke clearly, "Do not go with them. You must not put a curse on those people because they are blessed." Numbers 22:12. When Balaam relayed God's answer to Balak's emissaries, his words were firm, but his heart wavered. Balaak, undeterred, sent a more prestigious delegation with even greater promises of wealth and honor. Balaam's response reveals his inner conflict. "Even if Balaak gave me all the silver and gold in his palace, I could not do anything great or small to go beyond the command of the Lord my God." Numbers 22:18. Yet, despite this bold declaration, Balaam invited the emissaries to stay another night, hoping for a different response from God. This moment captures the essence of Balaam's divided nature. While he outwardly professed obedience, his repeated engagement with Balak's men suggests an inner yearning for the rewards they offered. And so, when God permitted Balaam to go with the emissaries, though under strict instructions to say only what God commanded, it wasn't a change in divine intent, but a reflection of Balaam's own persistent desire. Here we find a universal lesson. How often do we, like Balaam, rationalize our actions under the guise of seeking God's will, all while harboring motives that conflict with his commands? Balaam's hesitation and repeated questioning show how dangerous it is to let greed and ambition influence our decisions. Visually, picture Balaam in his home, pacing restlessly as Balak's emissaries offer gold and promises of honor. His mind races, torn between the clear voice of God and the enticing vision of wealth and prestige. Outside, the servants of Balaak wait, their ornate gifts gleaming in the torchlight, a stark contrast to the humble surroundings of the prophet. Balaam's divided heart would soon lead him into a surreal encounter that would forever change the course of his journey. But before we get there, consider this. How often do we find ourselves in Balaam's shoes, torn between what we know is right and the tantalizing lure of personal gain? How do we navigate the tension? Balaam's story challenges us to examine our motives and remember that true obedience requires a surrendered heart, not just outward actions. Balaam's journey to meet King Balaak is one of the most surreal and symbolic moments in the Bible. It's a story that blends the extraordinary with the profound, revealing the dangers of spiritual blindness and the lengths to which God will go to steer us back onto the right path. Having received God's conditional permission to go with Balak's emissaries, Balaam saddled his donkey and set out. But as he traveled, something remarkable happened. God, displeased with Balaam's underlying motives, sent an angel to block his path. Here's where the narrative takes a dramatic turn. The angel was invisible to Balaam, but not to his donkey. As they traveled, the donkey saw the angel standing in the road with a drawn sword. Frightened, the animal veered off the path into a field. Balaam, oblivious to the angel's presence, struck the donkey to force it back on the road. But the encounter wasn't over. Farther along, the angel appeared again, this time in a narrow passage between two vineyards, with walls on either side. The donkey, seeing the angel once more, pressed against the wall, crushing Balaam's foot. Furious, Balaam struck the donkey a second time. Finally, the angel appeared in an even narrower spot where there was no room to turn. The terrified donkey simply lay down under Balaam. Enraged, Balaam struck the animal again with his staff. And then the unthinkable happened. The donkey spoke. "What have I done to you to make you beat me these 3 times?" Numbers 22:28. Balaam, rather than being startled by the talking donkey, answered as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "You have made a fool of me. If only I had a sword in my hand, I would kill you right now." Numbers 22:29. The donkey's response was both simple and profound. "Am I not your own donkey, which you have always ridden to this day? Have I been in the habit of doing this to you?" Numbers 22:30. Balaam, finally pausing, admitted, "No." At this moment, the Lord opened Balaam's eyes, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road, sword drawn. The angel rebuked Balaam, saying, "Why have you beaten your donkey these 3 times? I have come here to oppose you because your path is a reckless one before me." Numbers 22:32. This encounter is rich with symbolism. The donkey, a humble and unassuming creature, could see what Balaam, the so-called prophet, could not. It's a powerful reminder of how pride and self-interest can blind us to spiritual realities. Balaam's rage, his immediate recourse to violence, and his lack of awareness all point to the dangers of a heart not fully aligned with God. Visually, this moment begs for dramatic portrayal. The angel standing tall and fearsome in the middle of the path, the donkey trembling, and Balaam, staff in hand, caught between confusion and terror as his spiritual blindness is stripped away. The narrow passageways, the shadows of the vineyards, and the final confrontation in a tight space create a palpable sense of tension and divine intervention. Reflect on this. How often do we ignore the warnings and obstacles God places in our path, stubbornly pursuing our desires? Balaam's encounter with the angel reminds us that God's love includes correction. He places roadblocks not to harm us, but to guide us back onto the right path. With his eyes now opened and his mission clarified, Balaam's journey to Balaak would continue. But the events on that road would echo throughout the rest of his story, a constant reminder that God's will cannot be manipulated, no matter how much we might try. Balaam's arrival in Moab was met with great anticipation. Balaak, the Moabite king, had pinned his hopes on Balaam's ability to curse the Israelites, believing that this spiritual attack could weaken them where military force could not. But what unfolded next was a dramatic display of divine power, one that revealed God's unwavering commitment to his people and his ability to turn curses into blessings. Balaak brought Balaam to the high places of Baal, a vantage point overlooking the encampment of Israel. From there, Balaam could see the vast multitude of God's people stretched across the plains. Balaak urged him to pronounce the curse, promising even greater rewards if he succeeded. But Balaam, constrained by God's command, warned the king, "I can only speak the words God puts in my mouth." Numbers 23:12. Balaam instructed Balaak to build 7 altars and offer sacrifices of bulls and rams. Then, stepping aside, he sought a word from God. When he returned, Balaam delivered his first prophecy, a startling proclamation that defied Balaak's expectations. Instead of a curse, Balaam declared, "How can I curse those whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce those whom the Lord has not denounced?" Numbers 23:8. Balaam's words painted a picture of Israel's divine protection. he described them as a people set apart, blessed by God, and invincible to human schemes. Balaak, understandably frustrated, exclaimed, "What have you done to me? I brought you to curse my enemies, but you have done nothing but bless them." Numbers 23:11. Yet Balaam reminded him that he could only speak what God commanded. Undeterred, Balaak took Balaam to another location, the field of Zophim, hoping a different perspective might yield a different outcome. Again, 7 altars were built, sacrifices were made, and Balaam sought God's word. The second prophecy was even more emphatic in its blessings. Balaam spoke of Israel's strength, comparing them to a lion that none could overpower. He concluded with the powerful declaration, "God is not human, that he should lie, nor a human being, that he should change his mind. Does he speak and then not act? Does he promise and not fulfill?" Numbers 23:19. Balaak's frustration boiled over, yet he made one final attempt. He led Balaam to Peor, overlooking the desert. Here, for the third time, the ritual of altars and sacrifices was repeated. But this time, something extraordinary happened. Balaam didn't need to seek God. The Spirit of God came upon him directly. What followed was a breathtaking prophecy, one that went beyond blessings for Israel and ventured into the realm of messianic hope. Balaam proclaimed Israel's future greatness and ultimate victory over their enemies. He spoke of a star rising out of Jacob, a scepter out of Israel, a prophecy many scholars interpret as a foreshadowing of the Messiah. Balaam's words soared beyond the immediate context, pointing to the eternal plan of God through his chosen people. The third prophecy was the final straw for Balaak. Furious, he told Balaam to return home, lamenting, "I summoned you to curse my enemies, but you have blessed them these 3 times. Numbers 24:10. Balaak's plan had utterly failed, and the prophet he had hired to harm Israel had instead become a mouthpiece for their divine favor. This series of blessings reveals a profound truth. No weapon formed against God's people can prosper. Balaam's inability to curse Israel demonstrates that God's purposes cannot be thwarted by human schemes. Even when the enemy seeks to harm, God can turn the situation around for his glory and our good. Visually, imagine the grandeur of these moments. Balaam standing on the mountain peaks, overlooking the vast encampment of Israel. The golden glow of the altars, the smoke rising from the sacrifices, and the majestic backdrop of the desert wilderness all underscore the gravity of these events. Balaak's frustration is palpable, his desperation growing with each failed attempt to manipulate the spiritual realm. Reflect on this. How often do we fear the schemes of others, forgetting that God's protection is unshakable? Balaam's prophecies remind us of God's sovereignty and his faithfulness to those who trust him. Despite Balaak's wealth and influence, he could not alter the destiny God had ordained for Israel. But Balaam's story doesn't end here. Though he spoke words of blessing, his heart remained divided. What happens next reveals the tragic consequences of a prophet who, despite witnessing God's power, ultimately succumbs to greed. Despite Balaam's remarkable prophecies and his role as a vessel for God's blessings, his story takes a dark and shocking turn. The same prophet who declared Israel's divine protection would ultimately betray them. How did a man who spoke with such clarity about God's sovereignty fall into treachery? The answer lies in a dangerous combination of greed, manipulation, and moral compromise. When Balaam left Balaak, his words suggested that he would remain obedient to God. But appearances can be deceiving. Though Balaam was unable to curse Israel directly, his heart was still drawn to the wealth and recognition Balaak had offered. Instead of accepting that God's will was unchangeable, Balaam sought another way to gain what he desired. According to Numbers 31:16 and Revelation 2:14, Balaam advised Balaak to use a subtler, more insidious tactic, seduction. If Israel could not be cursed, perhaps they could be corrupted. Balaam's plan was simple yet devastating. Entice the Israelites into idolatry and immorality, causing them to bring God's judgment upon themselves. Balaak acted on Balaam's advice. The Moabite women were sent to the Israelites' camp, luring them into forbidden relationships and inviting them to participate in pagan worship. Numbers 25 records the tragic consequences of this betrayal. Many Israelites succumbed to temptation, joining in sacrifices to Baal and bowing down to foreign gods. The result was catastrophic. God's wrath burned against his people, and a plague struck the camp, killing 24,000. Balaam's betrayal highlights a critical truth. Spiritual gifts and insight are no guarantee of moral integrity. Balaam had the knowledge and the ability to hear God's voice, yet his heart was consumed by self-interest. His actions serve as a stark warning about the dangers of compromising one's convictions for personal gain. Visually, imagine the contrast. The bustling Israelite camp, once vibrant with worship of the true God, now tainted by the influence of Moabite idols. The golden idols of Baal glint in the sunlight as Israelites bow before them, their leaders' faces shadowed with sorrow and shame. Meanwhile, in the Moabite palace, Balaam counts his reward, oblivious to the spiritual destruction he has caused. Reflect on this for a moment. How often do we rationalize small compromises, thinking they'll have no real consequence? Balaam's story reveals the devastating ripple effects of such decisions. What begins as a single compromise can lead to a chain reaction that causes harm not just to ourselves, but to those around us. Though Balaam's betrayal brought immense suffering to Israel, it did not thwart God's ultimate plan. Israel repented, and the plague ceased. But Balaam's fate was sealed. His actions marked him as an enemy of God's people, and divine justice would soon catch up with him. Balaam's story, a tale of spiritual insight turned to betrayal, reaches its final chapter in a moment of divine judgment. Though Balaam played a key role in corrupting Israel, his actions did not go unnoticed by God. The very people he sought to harm would ultimately be the instruments of his downfall. After the tragic events of Baal Peor, where Israel faced God's wrath for their idolatry and immorality, the Israelites regrouped under Moses' leadership. God commanded them to take vengeance on the Midianites, who had conspired with Moab in leading Israel astray. Numbers 31 recounts this military campaign, during which Israel defeated the Midianites and executed their leaders. Among the slain was Balaam. It's striking that Balaam, a prophet who once claimed to speak only what God commanded, ended his life among the enemies of God's people. He had aligned himself with those who sought to destroy Israel, and his choices ultimately sealed his fate. His death was not just a punishment for his betrayal, but also a stark reminder of the inevitability of divine justice. Balaam's demise serves as a culmination of his moral decline. Despite witnessing God's power firsthand, through direct communication, miraculous blessings, and even the intervention of an angel, Balaam allowed greed and ambition to dominate his decisions. His tragic end highlights the dangers of knowing God's truth, but refusing to live by it. Visually, the scene is somber and evocative. The battlefield littered with the remains of Midianite warriors, the dust settling as the victorious Israelites gather to count the spoils of war. Balaam's lifeless body lies among the fallen leaders, a symbol of the consequences of spiritual compromise and defiance against God's will. The contrast between his earlier position as a revered prophet and his final fate could not be starker. But Balaam's story is more than a historical account. It holds powerful lessons for us today. His life warns us about the dangers of divided loyalty and the consequences of letting our desires lead us away from God's path. Balaam had the knowledge and opportunity to honor God, yet he chose a path of self-interest, ultimately losing everything. Reflect on this. How often do we allow our ambitions to cloud our judgment? Do we, like Balaam, try to manipulate situations to suit our desires, even when we know it goes against God's will? Balaam's story challenges us to examine our priorities and ensure that our actions align with our faith. Yet, even in the shadow of Balaam's failure, there is hope. His story reminds us of the importance of repentance and obedience. While Balaam chose the path of compromise, we are invited to choose differently, to trust in God's sovereignty, resist the lure of worldly rewards, and live with integrity. As the story of Balaam draws to a close, it leaves us with one final question. What legacy will we leave behind? Will we be remembered as people who honored God, or as those who, like Balaam, allowed greed and ambition to lead us astray?